So thank you, Deborah. Appreciate that, and appreciate all the work that you do through the ISAC, as well as the collection of ISACs that exist out there, phenomenal resources that are out there and available for you. There we go. So, my slides. There we go. So I think Deborah's presentation actually hit on a number of very important points, and possibly most importantly, the importance of public and private sector cooperation and collaboration to address a lot of these challenges. And that really gets at the kind of the spirit of a recent executive order that was signed by the President in February on improving critical infrastructure cybersecurity. What I want to do today in the few minutes that we have for this particular session is to focus on, give a little bit of an overview on the executive order as a whole, and then focus more specifically on NIST specified responsibilities within that executive order and its implementation. So the executive order 13636 for improving critical infrastructure cybersecurity was signed on February 12th by the President. And it was really, there's some quotes that are pulled out from the executive order itself, really focusing specifically on the cyber threat to critical infrastructure that continues to grow and is representative of one of the most significant challenges that our nation faces. And within that executive order, it also expresses a statement on U.S. policy with respect to critical infrastructure cybersecurity. Within the executive order, it also has, by reference, kind of a pointer to the identified critical infrastructure sectors, and I believe today there are currently 16 sectors that have been specified, one of which is the healthcare and public health sector, which is, I think, most of interest to folks here today. In general, when we talk about this particular sector, the healthcare and public health sector, really talking about the services that provided to protect all sectors and citizens and organizations, kind of from the hazards of infectious disease outbreaks, natural disasters, terrorism attacks, those types of things. Certainly play a significant role in the response and recovery activities related to, as a result of some of those actions. And those services are carried out not only just at a local level, kind of within the states and the local communities through the healthcare service providers and those types of organizations, but also more broadly across the nation or regional when we think of public health more specifically. So the executive order focuses on two, in my mind, kind of two different two work streams that are very much interrelated. One is the information sharing, so the ability, much like Deborah was talking about, with the ISAC model, the ability to have information and share that information in such a way that it can be used in an actionable way to address cybersecurity threats that are being observed. But also, more broadly speaking, building a set of current and successful approaches, whether those be a collection of standards, guidelines, tools, practices, technologies, and measurements, a framework is what it's called within the executive order that can help to reduce cyber risk to critical infrastructure. And NIST is specifically called out in the executive order to develop what's called the cybersecurity framework. So I think there's a number of reasons why NIST was selected to perform these responsibilities. One, we're a non-regulatory federal agency. We are an unbiased source of technical data, of measurement data, and scientific data and practices. When you look at, and this is something Deborah mentioned as well, when you look at critical infrastructure as a whole, again, a very significant portion of critical infrastructure is private sector owned and operated. And when you look at NIST's core mission, it is to work collaboratively with industry and the private sector, not only to ensure kind of innovation and industrial competitiveness, but also to, we have a very long and successful partnership, many examples of successful partnerships with our industry partners as well across all different sectors. So I think that's really why NIST was called out in this particular capacity. So the framework calls out a few specific things on what it will be. The first is identify security standards and guidelines that are applicable across sectors of the critical infrastructure. So when you look at the landscape of critical infrastructure and you have these 16 sectors, what are those things that are kind of common practices that would apply across the board, in an effort to kind of establish and raise that baseline a little bit across the board. of all those sectors. Some of the core principles that are called out throughout the executive order, prioritized, a flexible approach, repeatable, performance-based, cost-effective, with the intent of really enabling the owners and operators of the critical infrastructure to be able to identify, to assess, and manage their cyber risks. What are the tools and technologies and the standards and guidelines and other practices and approaches that exist today that can help critical infrastructure owners and operators, those organizations, to be able to manage risk and improve their overall cybersecurity status? And then, a very important follow-on, I think, through this framework effort is going to be to identify gaps. So we know that there's this collection of resources that are out there today, but it may not necessarily be all the standards and guidelines and tools and practices that we need to address all the different streams and themes within the cybersecurity space. So being able to identify those gaps where additional work is needed, and then being able to work with, across the sectors and with the standards development organizations to close those gaps. So the cybersecurity framework, there's kind of this slide, and then the next one is what it is and what it is not. Very much focused on collaboration. This is not something that NIST can develop. Like Deborah said, kind of NIST and the government can develop and hand off to the critical infrastructure owners and operators. We like to look at this as kind of the inverted pyramid, where NIST is kind of the tip of the pyramid at the bottom, providing the support and kind of that convener role for the owners and operators of the critical infrastructure to come together and help us to work collaboratively with us to develop that framework. Part of this is also to identify those voluntary consensus-based and industry best practices to the fullest extent possible. So what are the effective practices that are in use today within your sector or across all sectors? And, where they're within a particular sector, how do we take those and identify how they can be applied across the broader collection of sectors as well? One of the important points of this, though, is that we're not... the intent is not to develop a whole new set of standards and guidelines and practices to the extent possible. Where there are gaps, then that may kind of spawn new work streams to close those gaps through additional standards activities and things like that. But where voluntary standards are existing, that's the direction that those are the resources that we're going to be using. And then also not introduce practices that would in any way, shape, or form compromise the protection of intellectual property or privacy, introduce any privacy or civil liberties issues as well. So the remainder of the slides are going to talk about these handful of steps that we've laid out in our NIST implementation of our responsibilities under the executive order. I think the key takeaway for this slide, though, is that the blue box in the bottom left corner is that this is really dependent upon the ongoing engagement of the critical infrastructure owners and operators, really that public and private collaboration to make this a success and make the end result of this framework, the final framework that we're called to issue within 1 year of the date of the executive order issuance, something that's going to be usable to the critical infrastructure owners and operators and you as organizations either that fall within that sector, the healthcare sector, or in support of the broader critical infrastructure community. So I want to take a couple minutes to walk through the framework process a little bit. So the executive order was signed on February 12th by the President. On February 26th, NIST issued a request for information in the Federal Register. We actually issued kind of a draft version of that on our NIST website the same day or the day after the executive order was signed, but the official RFI went out on February 26th. And in that, we sought information from industry on current risk management practices, the use of framework, standards, guidelines, and best practices out there today, and then specific industry practices. So what are those things that may be specific to the healthcare sector or to the energy sector or the finance or the water and waste treatment or the commercial facilities? The list goes on and on. And that RFI comment period closed on April 8th. Now, in the middle there, actually just before the end, we had our first public workshop on April 3rd, and that was held adjacent to this building here at the headquarters for the Department of Commerce. And we're very fortunate to have representation from nearly all the 16 sectors, not only in attendance, but also participating in some way, whether it be as a speaker or as a panelist. And Deborah and a number of other representatives from the NHISAC and some of the member organizations representing, say, the pharmaceutical sector, for example, as well as some healthcare providers participate in that as well as representatives from a collection of other sectors also. And that was really kind of NIST's chance to kind of pop our head up, give a current status of where we stand with respect to what we've seen up to that point, as well as hear more from industry in those sectors on the value of this framework, what the framework could be when it's done, how it could be providing value, and some other other valuable feedback that we could take at that time. So the RFI period closed on April 8th. We received over 250 responses from organizations or sectors, organizations or sector-wide responses representing almost all 16 sectors. And that was wonderful to have such broad participation there and the responses there. It was great. So NIST, when we received those responses, our job was really to kind of make sense of the data. The RFI called out a series of questions in the categories that I described earlier. So some of the risk management practices, what are the things that you do today to manage risk, how does that integrate overall business risk with the cyber risk, and how do you make informed decisions based on cyber as it relates to your overall mission and business process. What are those standards and tools and technologies that work today for you, and what are some of those areas where there are gaps that you've identified to date. And we did kind of an initial analysis. All of those responses to the RFI are posted publicly, and they're posted on that website at the bottom of this slide. In an effort to be open and transparent throughout the process and really to encourage the engagement from all the sectors and the organizations that kind of fall within those sectors, everything that we're producing as a result of this or throughout this process will be posted publicly on a NIST site. So our initial analysis, we did a quick pass through all the data and kind of categorized the data into a number of different, based on a number of different topics. What are the regulatory or legal specifications or standards that have been called out? What are measures and metrics that organizations use within your sector to kind of measure and manage cybersecurity risk or cybersecurity in general? What are the current practices that work for you today? What are the future practices that you may not have in place today but would provide value when you're trying to manage your cybersecurity risk for your organization or for your sector? What are some of the privacy and civil liberties challenges? And then kind of a catch-all other category as well, the framework development as well. So what are your thoughts as the responding organizations on what the framework should look like and how it can provide value to using organizations at the end? Here's kind of a graphical representation of that process. So the response comes in and we go through each of the response. All of the over 250 responses had at least one set of eyes on them. Most had two sets of eyes just to ensure that we had full coverage of those. And be able to kind of go through those responses, ranging anywhere from a couple of sentences all the way to over 100 pages, and try to distill those responses down into what are those kind of, the responses that we received related to the specific questions that we asked within the RFI, and what are those kind of nuggets of wisdom, if you will, that we want to extract from those responses and put forth as potential inclusion into the framework. And again, another kind of graphical representation of the framework process. So now we've gone through all the responses. We have all this data that we've kind of distilled down from the responses themselves. How do we make sense of this data, within the different categories that we establish, whether it be risk management challenges all the way through to suggested metrics and initial gaps, and then doing an analysis on that subset of the data. How do we identify those? What are those commonalities that appear to be kind of bubbling up to the top? Across all the sectors, something that could be applied across all the sectors. Now, and I think I've touched on most of these points here, but the analysis of the RFI responses included, an initial pass on what sectors were covered. So, which did we receive? Representative responses from all the 16 sectors, and we almost got there. what are the kind of the relevant sections of the text that were related to the specific questions we asked within the RFI, and then what were those other kind of nuggets that we could extract that would provide additional input into the overall framework activity. At that point, we also had kind of a parallel work stream to identify some of those common terms and phrases that we continued to see popping up repeatedly across all the RFI responses. And then we did some additional kind of keyword searches and analysis based on those common terms and phrases to kind of get a better picture of what all those themes were that continued to pop up across the board. And that was certainly used as part of our initial analysis that we posted publicly last week. So as we did this initial analysis, a lot of the recurring and the common themes that we observed through the RFI responses, we kind of categorize them in three different ways. So one is kind of core framework principles, flexibility, for example, the importance of senior management engagement as two of the examples, kind of the overarching principles that would apply across the board, and that were expressed repeatedly throughout a large percentage of the RFI responses. What are those common points? So the practices that were identified as having wide utility and adoption across all the sectors. And then any initial gaps that were identified. And gaps kind of defined in two ways. One as gaps that were identified by the respondents to the RFI. So we know that there's a gap here. There's no standard that addresses this particular aspect of cybersecurity. Another way to look at gap from our perspective is we at NIST expected to receive more input on this particular topic, and we didn't. So we view that as a gap for future discussion to kind of plug those holes as we go through this process. So part of our outreach campaign, if you will, because we need to encourage the constant engagement with both the public and the private sector owners and operators of the critical infrastructure, is a series of workshops over the next several months. The first one, as I mentioned, was in early April, just a one-day event here in D.C., kind of a pop the head up from a NIST perspective to give an overview of where we are today, but also hear from the industry representatives on the framework activities as a whole. Our next workshop is going to be next week, actually, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday at Carnegie Mellon University. It will be hosted by CMU. The purpose of this workshop is to take our initial analysis and kind of all that data from that we gleaned from the RFI responses and go through that over a series of 2.5 days of facilitated working sessions so that by the end of the workshop we have what we would consider kind of that superset of all the data that we need to be able to move forward to develop the framework, again, hand in hand with industry. And also to be able to identify come to a consensus agreement on what are those commonalities that appear to be kind of at that baseline level that have been expressed through the RFI responses and that we hope to kind of tease out as we go through the workshop activities next week as well. Again, this will be the second of 4 workshops, and I'll hit on the other ones as we go through. So for the workshops next week and then kind of moving forward leading up to yet another workshop in the July time period, we believe the framework is going to include approaches that are successfully used by organizations across a variety of sectors and then also are consistent with many of the criteria or all the criteria that were specifically called out in the executive order, and some of them are mentioned there. First, focusing on the appropriate protections for privacy and civil liberties, basing those on the fair information practice principles, maintaining business confidentiality, the flexible, repeatable performance, cost-based or cost-effective and technology-neutral principles, and that are well aligned with established performance measures for the framework and for the use of the framework. So as we move forward in the framework development process, so now we've got this kind of this common set of practices, methods, measures, standards, guidelines. What is that superset of all the data out there? Then we go through through a series of other criteria, which are listed here, to essentially come up with the framework components that we're going to be moving forward with within the scope of the framework as we develop that. We'll draft an initial framework based on those candidate framework components, and then present the framework in a manner that is usable, clear, suitable for multiple audiences, multi-tiered, and practical and implementable. Not a small feat. And then as we move forward with our third workshop, actually our fourth workshop, I'm sorry, in the September timeframe, is to discuss and refine the initial framework at that workshop as well. So our framework process, as we go through this process over the next several months, is to, will include a lot of key milestones. So validating the draft framework, again, in public settings through workshops as well as through public comment periods once we post the framework in the October time period. Confirming those documented and observed gaps. So again, the gaps that were expressed to us through the RFI responses from industry, as well as those areas that we've identified as gaps where we anticipated hearing more. So kind of validating those as well. As well as kind of teeing up that discussion for how do we address those gaps over time. Some of those may spawn, standards development processes in the standards development organizations. Some of those may be sector-specific issues that we'll want to work with or engage the sector and the sector community to come up with an action plan to address as well. Be able to present that preliminary framework, at the fourth workshop, which will be in September. I'm getting my dates messed up here. And then in the October time period, issue the draft framework for public comment in the middle of October as called for in the executive order. So here are a collection of important resources that I think you may find of interest. The first is the executive order itself. The second is a copy of the RFI that we issued. The third is all the responses that we received in response to the RFI. As I mentioned earlier, last week we posted our initial analysis of those RFI responses, kind of identifying what are those overarching principles, the common points, and the initial gaps that were defined, or that we observed based on our analysis of the responses. And then, the catch-all, all of our resources related to the cybersecurity framework for the executive order are captured on at that bottom URL as well. And certainly we have a public an email address that folks can submit comments to if you have additional questions, and it's listed at the bottom there, cyberframework@nist.gov. I think that might be the last one. So with that said, are there any questions? Clear as mud. Good. So I think this actually, we've heard about the threat space. We've heard about from Deborah, we've heard about the cybersecurity framework and all the standards and guidelines that are out there and the tools and technologies and practices that can be used. And I think we've heard a good bit over the last couple of days on the availability of many of these technologies on the market today that are available on the market, and many of which you might be already using within your organizations. Wouldn't it be a great idea? Wouldn't it be great if there was some sort of place where government and industry, kind of the business and mission process owners, and the IT companies and the academics can come together in a collaborative setting? One may call it a center, and it would be great if it was an excellent center, to come together and work side by side to take all these different things that are out there and integrate them in such a way that we're actually solving or addressing some of the cybersecurity challenges that we face today. And that's kind of the cue for Nate Lesser, if Nate's out there, who's there you are, right there. NIST has established such a center with the strong support and assistance